A hardworking nurse spends her days treating patients with great care. At night, however, she lets loose a darker side on unwitting, unfaithful men. An attractive woman named Abigail Abby Russell puts on makeup in the ladies' room before walking out to a party filled with what she describes as unfaithful husbands. One of the men stows away his wedding ring upon spotting her and tries to buy her a drink. She then pulls a bill in his pocket and takes out his ring, asking what his wife would think. After that, Abby walks away but beckons him to her anyway. The two end up on the rooftop, where Abby flirts with the man, swipes his wallet, and taunts him with his own personal information. The man named Fred momentarily enjoys her teasing and shamelessly admits his infidelity until Abby slices the femoral artery in his thigh. Abby mocks Fred's helpless situation, like a predator toying with its prey. She then shoves the profusely bleeding Fred off the rooftop, leaving him impaled on a spiked fence below. The next day, Abby strolls through the halls of All Saints Memorial Hospital, where she works as a top-performing nurse. She describes the predatory nature of the male employees there, as well as her mentorship of a newbie named Danny Rogers. By day, Abby diligently performs her medical duties while luring and killing unfaithful men by night. During a welcoming ceremony, All Saints Memorial Hospital's Chief of Staff, Dr. Robert Morris, greets the newly hired nurses, calling them angels of mercy. Head nurse Betty Watson speaks next, congratulating the newbies for joining the Nurses Corps, and pins a medal to a beaming Danny. After the ceremony, Danny introduces Abby to her mother, her boyfriend Steve, and her stepfather Dr. Larry Cook, a psychiatrist. Abby shakes hands a tad bit longer with Larry, then leaves as Steve toasts Danny's success. On Danny's first day of duty, in one of the hospital's dimly lit wards, she gets grabbed by a man from the shadows, but it turns out to be Steve, who works as a paramedic and proceeds to get intimate with her. The two abruptly stop their tryst when Danny balks at Steve's suggestion to move in with him, citing a number of adjustments she's making in life. Then, a nurse, Regina, interrupts their argument, and the two hurriedly get dressed. Later on, Dr. Morris scolds Danny, who's shocked and frozen by the gruesome sight of patients arriving at the hospital. Inside, Abby looks on, noting how Dr. Morris gets off on treating new nurses with hostility. At the end of their shift, Abby spies Danny in the locker room, arguing on the phone with Steve over his lack of empathy. Abby walks in to get changed, annoyed that Danny turned to her boyfriend instead of her. She reassures the newbie, who's still agonizing over her screw-up, inviting her out for a drink. Afterward, Danny, accompanied by Abby, spots Larry picking up a woman from a nearby hotel. Danny confronts her stepfather, but he brushes her off after making feeble excuses, then drives away with his mistress. Moments later, in a nightclub, Abby gets Danny drunk and takes her to the dance floor. Danny has no idea there's something in her drink, and it isn't long before Abby is kissing her and taking pictures of the act. Abby then grabs a guy who joined them and pushes him to make out with Danny, who eventually ends up in bed with the stranger. The next morning, Danny wakes up feeling groggy in Abby's apartment and has no recollection of what happened the previous night. Danny also declines Abby's suggestion to call in sick and looks for her clothes. Abby thinks to herself how Danny is in denial of what happened, fearing Steve might find out she slept with a stranger. An infuriated Abby ogles Danny while the latter gets dressed. After Danny leaves for work, Abby downloads the incriminating photos from her phone to her laptop. A couple of hours later, Abby is hailed by a guy on a bicycle who chats with her. The guy Jared, who transports cadavers to the anatomy lab, worries about Abby going out alone at night. She admires Jared's concern, kisses him on the cheek, then gets in a cab to 75 Rockefeller. Abby visits Larry's office as a patient, fully knowing the man is a cheater. She admits to being addicted to men, recounting how it was rooted in her admiration for her doctor father when she was young. When Abby asks if he could help her, Larry informs her that curing addiction is a process and that he'll see her in next week's session. He then gives Abby a cell number, which she accepts with a dash of flattery and seduction before leaving. The next day in the hospital, Danny receives a vase of flowers from Steve with an envelope that's ripped open, confusing her. Later, Dr. Morris instructs Abby to give vecuronium to his patient to keep him immobilized while he's still under observation. He also subjects an uncomfortable Danny to some lewd behavior, which Abby catches. When Danny goes to fetch vecuronium for Abby, Morris makes another inappropriate pass at her. Feeling slighted by Steve and Danny's affection for each other, Abby sneaks into the locker room and smashes Danny's vase of flowers. Danny later comes out of the shower to find Abby worrying while cleaning up the vase. Danny waves it off, and the two get to talking about how Danny got together with her boyfriend. As it turns out, Danny met Steve when they were freshmen in college, and he comforted her when her father died in a car accident. Abby emphasizes and recalls how she lost her father when she was 8 years old. Abby then gives Danny a spare key, offering her apartment as a refuge from either Larry or Steve. Danny relates how the only reason she goes home is to protect her mom from Larry, which Abby understands. That night, Abby meets with Larry in a provocative outfit and gets in his car. The two have a veiled discussion on where they can treat Abby's addiction, and Larry drives off to a dark alley. Once parked, Larry starts caressing Abby, but she teasingly ties him up, whips out a syringe, and injects him with a paralyzing chemical, vecuronium, in the neck. Abby then taunts the psychiatrist that his death would leave his wife a huge amount of money, all without her finding out he was a cheater. After putting the vehicle in reverse, she exits the car, revealing in the fact that Larry's demise was the ideal opportunity to get with Danny. The car rolls backward with the paralyzed Larry inside until a truck collides with it. Larry gets thrown to the passenger side window, and Abby takes the ribbon she used to tie up the guy and her jacket she left in the car while pretending to call 911. Then, she leaves as cops rush to the crash site. Later that night, Abby returns to her apartment building, greets Jared, and goes inside her unit. However, she finds Danny sitting in the kitchen, and the girl tells her through tears that Larry has been killed. Abby embraces her, promising to take care of her. Afterward, Abby comforts Danny, but the latter tells her that she'll be moving in with Steve. Abby lashes out like a scorned lover, causing Danny to decide to leave out of fear and confusion. Abby intercepts Danny's rush for the door, mouthing off specific details about Larry's death out of spite. This freaks out Danny even more since she didn't tell her Larry was in a car crash, and she leaves the apartment. After attending Larry's funeral, Danny sees Abby talking to a tall man. The man approaches Danny, introducing himself as Detective Rogan, who's in charge of investigating Larry's case. He leaves his calling card in case Danny has any information she might want to relay later. Danny then confronts Abby, who assumes a pitiful aura and informs her that she was one of Larry's patients. Abby offers her condolences and walks away, resolving to focus her attention back on her night job. Days later, Regina complains about a peppy female employee going around the hospital slapping smiley stickers everywhere. Danny, on the other hand, gets shocked upon receiving a message containing pictures of her wild night with Abby and the random guy. Danny closes the message and bolts out of her seat just as the smiling lady enters their office. The lady, new HR Director Rachel Adams, acquires Abby's whereabouts from Regina before handing her a smiley sticker. Rachel finds Abby tending to a patient, noticing how the nurse looks like someone she knew but can't quite place how or where. After advising on work-related stuff, Rachel realizes that Abby looks like her neighbor Sarah Price, who was sent to Sunnyview Institute as a kid. She also recounts how Sarah put up her mother's house for sale the last time she saw her. Danny overhears this just as Abby watches Rachel leave. That night, Abby invites a startled Rachel for a drink at a place called the Sutton, which the HR director cheerfully accepts. At home, Danny is packing things into her car when Abby calls, inviting her for a night out with Rachel. Clutching a huge bag, Danny declines and lies about being in Steve's house, but Abby notes the bag, implying she's somewhere nearby. Abby drops the call, and Danny drives away unnerved. Arriving at Steve's place, Danny notices the computer chime with an email notification. She opens the message to reveal a trove of pictures of her depraved night with Abby and the stranger. Steve shows up, and Danny manages to distract him long enough to delete the pictures from the computer. The two try getting intimate, but a distracted Danny blurts out about Abby's connection to Larry. Steve then receives a text and is summoned to work, promising to hear out whatever is bothering Danny before leaving. Later that night, Danny wakes up to a video call on her laptop, which turns out to be from an intoxicated Rachel. Abby stalks behind the giggling woman, producing a large syringe aimed at Rachel, which prompts Danny to shriek warnings at the screen. Just as the needle is poised to pierce Rachel's neck, the call ends. Danny calls 911 to report what she saw, directing the dispatcher to Abby's address, but then receives another video call from Abby. The deranged nurse displays Rachel's limp body while issuing threats and clutching a doll before dropping the call. The next day, Danny makes a statement at the police station, but sees Abby leaving the place after speaking to Rogan. The detective then informs Danny that Rachel is fine and confronts her about accusing Abby of killing the HR director just as Steve arrives. Danny argues that Abby is messing with her, but Rogan counters that it's her who has an obsession with Abby. When Danny refutes this, the detective reveals the pictures of her and Abby kissing in the club, to Steve's horror. Unable to prove that Abby put something in her drink that night, Danny is told to stay away from Abby. Danny then accuses Abby of killing Larry, but Rogan notes that vecuronium was found in the man's system. The detective also remarks that Danny signed out the same paralytic substance the day her stepfather died. As they leave the police station, Danny attempts to explain herself to Steve but to no avail. Furious at what he saw as a gross betrayal, Steve rides off, leaving Danny on the street. Later in the hospital, Abby spots Danny talking to Dr. Morris in his office. Meanwhile, Rachel is about to look up pictures of Sarah Price when someone covers her mouth with a cloth and grabs her from her seat. A few days later, Danny visits Sunnyview Institute, where an orderly recounts Sarah Price's history to her. As it turns out, Sarah walked in on her father while he was engaged in inappropriate activity with his nurse. After her father injured her mother in the ensuing confrontation, Sarah slits the man's throat open with a scalpel couple. Sarah was then sent to Sunnyview after the nurse testified in favor of the mother. They look at one of Sarah's old photos, where she is shown holding a doll strikingly similar to the one Abby had in the video call. The orderly then recalls that after Sarah's mother took her own life, the child found a mother figure in a nurse named Janet. Danny is shown a picture of the nurse, whose full name was Janet Abigail Russell, implying that Sarah took the name for her own. Back in the hospital, Dr. Morris summons Abby in response to a complaint made about her by Danny. He then makes an indecent proposal to Abby, which she gladly accepts. Luring the doctor to the morgue, Abby grabs him and covers his mouth with a chemical-soaked cloth. Dr. Morris later wakes up gagged and bound to an autopsy table as Abby proceeds to carve the word pig into his chest with a scalpel. After threatening the doctor with numerous ways of dismemberment, Abby grabs a surgical power tool to sever his arm. Meanwhile, Danny contacts Regina in the hospital and asks the nurse to connect her to Rachel's phone while driving back. Rachel's phone rings, but Danny hears a phone ringing from somewhere in her car, eventually pulling over and finding it spattered with blood in the trunk. Danny calls Abby, who's having a wild time with Rogan. Abby answers the phone as Rogan goes to take a shower, and Danny asks her what she did to Rachel. Abby then alludes to Rachel's bloody fate, already framing Danny for the deed while threatening Steve. As the call ends, Danny warns Steve through voicemail to stay away from Abby and rushes to the hospital. At the same time, Abby leaves Rogan without a word. Danny eventually arrives outside the hospital just as Steve unknowingly gets into an elevator with Abby. In the police station, Rogan gets inside his office and hears a voicemail from Danny urging him to confirm Abby's true identity with Sunnyview. When Danny reaches the hospital corridors, she spots a nonchalant Abby and demands to know where Steve is. The two get into a scuffle, and Regina tries to interfere, but Abby smacks her unconscious to the floor. Danny pushes Abby into a laboratory, and they shove each other into the glass cases, scattering shards everywhere. Abby almost stabs Danny, but the latter manages to knock the crazy nurse back with an instrument. Running away, Abby tricks and shocks a guard unconscious with a defibrillator. Danny pursues her, telling the other nurses to call the police. She catches up to Abby and charges at her, ending up on the operating room floor. Then, a policeman arrives and helps Danny get up. However, Abby stabs the officer through the throat with scissors, ready to kill Danny next. Calling Abby by the name Sarah, Danny tries persuading her out of her murderous spree, but gets slashed across her back. Another officer tackles Abby to the floor, but she stabs him in the eye instead, screaming after and escaping Danny. Abby soon catches up to Danny, who overpowers her and seemingly knocks her unconscious. Then, Steve arrives and tries to calm Danny down. After a brief and stressed exchange, the two look back down to see Abby has slipped away. The two chase after Abby, but she locks herself inside a ward filled with patients and maims everyone in sight. Steve manages to break the door open with a stool, while Abby hides behind a curtain, and he and Danny rush inside to give first aid to the bleeding patients. Abby then gets a jump on the two by pretending to be an injured patient, kissing Danny, and stabbing Steve in the neck. Danny tends to Steve, and Abby escapes yet again. Later, as Abby leaves her apartment, Rogan shows up pointing a gun and arrests her for her connection to Larry's death. Abby tries but fails to seduce the detective, and resorts to pretending to be in distress after noticing someone peering from a door nearby. Jared shows up and swings a baseball bat on Rogan's head, killing him. Abby then exploits Jared's kindness to her, persuading the guy to dispose of the detective's body. She looks on, feeling accomplished with her work of eliminating men she viewed as despicable. Days later, Abby strolls into another hospital, St. Valentine's Medical Center, posing as its new HR officer, Rachel Owens.